Ladies and gentlemen, would you please rise for the arrival of the Honorable Colonel, retired Donald S. Ethel, Lieutenant Governor of Alberta, and the Vice-Regal Party. Please be seated. Well, good evening, everyone. What a wonderful full room we have this evening. Thank you so much to those of you who are joining us here tonight in person, and as well those of you that are joining us via the web. Welcome to the evening's presentation. Some of you are enjoying us from the comforts of your home. You don't get to enjoy the treats, though. So we've had some lovely treats, a nice reception, and now we're ready to begin the evening. I'm Nancy Reynolds. I'm the chair of the Institute of Families for Children's Mental Health, and I'll be your MC for this evening. I have just a few housekeeping notes. We will be taking a 15-minute intermission following Dr. Clinton's presentation, and we'll defer all questions this evening until after the panel has presented. A reminder to those of you that are viewing us tonight through the web, you too can submit your questions, and you can actually submit them at any time. Just input them into your computer, they'll pop up, and we'll make sure that your questions get before the panel and Dr. Clinton at the end of the evening. We're really thrilled with the interest in this evening's presentation, with all of the partners, including, of course, members of the Lieutenant Governor's Circle of Mental Health and Addiction, who came together to plan and sponsor the event tonight, to have such a fabulous presenter and a really distinguished panel this evening. It's also inspiring to know that today we're joined by others from across Canada in spreading awareness about child and youth mental health today, May 7th. Those of you in the room tonight should have been given a green ribbon when you came in. Many of you are sporting your green ribbon. People often ask, why green? Why a green ribbon? Well, in the 1800s, green was the color used to brand people labeled insane. Those of us involved with the children's mental health community decided to continue to use green, but to give it an entirely new meaning. We wanted it to have an enlightened focus. So green, we want you to think of it as signifying new life, new growth, and new beginnings. The theme for May 7th this year is I Care About You. What better topic for tonight than how love builds brains? In well over 100 Alberta schools today across the province, Child and Youth Mental Health Day was the focus of different events. Some of you joining us tonight on the web may have seen your son or daughter come home wearing a tattoo. Some of you here may have picked up a tattoo. I can assure you these are not permanent and will readily be removable. So it seems very fitting that the event tonight is coming to you from the Alberta Teachers Association auditorium, and that we have the pleasure of having Mark Ramsanker, President-elect of the Alberta Teachers Association, here to bring welcoming remarks. Mark.
Thank you. Your Honors, it's a privilege to be here this evening to welcome all of you as invited guests, both home and here this evening, on behalf of our President, Carol Henderson, and the Alberta Teachers Association. At any given time, 15% of the children and youth of this province are affected by mental health issues. And all too often, those issues go untreated. In fact, it is estimated that approximately 90% of the youth do not access the supports they need with problems they encounter through mental health issues, emotional issues, and drug and alcohol abuse. Our members, teachers in Alberta, are acutely aware of the incredible impact that unsupported mental health issues have on our youth and what this does to them in their homes. That is why the Alberta Teachers Association has been participating with the Canadian Mental Health Association for the past 5 years. At any given, Your Honors, we are very proud to play an active role and be part of the active role you have taken in bringing this issue to light. The Governor General's Circle on Mental Health and Drug and Alcohol Abuse is here to bring awareness, and we believe that with your help and through building awareness for teachers, we can go a long way in connecting children with the support they require. We are pleased to be a partner here this evening with the events with Dr. Clinton, who will be speaking about the importance of building relationships. Teachers know how important the relationships between children and positive adult role models are as they learn about the issues that they encounter and they learn about the value that they have. We look forward to continuing to work together to supporting your program in the future. After all, that is why teachers teach. Thank you very much for being here this evening.
Thank you very much, Mark, and again, thanks to the Alberta Teachers Association for their support of this event. It is now my very true pleasure to invite the Honourable Colonel Donald Ethel, Lieutenant Governor of Alberta, to the podium to bring remarks and introduce our speaker this evening. His Honour is the patron of the Circle of Mental Health for Mental Health and Addictions, and he is a passionate advocate for children's health. Many of us have heard him speak before. We're so pleased to have you with us here this evening.
Thank you very
Your
much.
Honor.
Thank you, Nancy, and good evening, everyone. My goodness, we've got a full house. We should have got a bigger room. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this special program to mark Child and Youth Mental Health Day, and to thank you for your dedication to this extremely important subject. For those of you that watch the news, and I'm sure you all do, it was carried on global with mental health and what they were doing in the schools. So it's known. The other thing I'll mention to you is today, the Governor General's wife, Her Excellency, took her husband along too, I guess he had to go, to a mental health symposium. So the word is spreading, and we're getting the word out more so than just Alberta. Others are getting on the bandwagon. We are having an annual meeting of all the lieutenant governors at the end of June, and Alberta is hosting this year. We're going to take them to Banff. No, we're not. They're going to pay their own way to Banff. But we're going to have our conference there, and you can bet your bottom dollar that when it comes my turn to speak, particularly as the chairman, that we'll be talking about mental health and, of course, the circle, because it's very near and dear to our hearts. The Lieutenant Governor's Circle on Mental Health and Addiction is pleased to be partnering with a number of organizations on this program. As you may know, our goal with the Circle is to encourage learning, growth, and acceptance as individuals and as a society when it comes to mental health. I digress again. I noticed on the news today they had a teenager on the stage of his school all by himself, and he admitted, quite frankly, he was nervous, but he was there to fight the stigma of mental health, the stigma of having to look in the mirror and say, I've got a problem. But at least he had the nerve to do that and sought help. We can and we will accomplish the goal by continuing to work together. Effective collaboration and cooperation are particularly important in the work of caring for our youngest citizens. In fact, we all have a role to play in helping children and youth in our society to become strong, healthy, and caring adults. I have great respect for Alberta's dedicated professionals who are working to build the best possible future for young Albertans. And that includes the experts who have kindly agreed, my apologies, kindly agreed to serve on this. This isn't being taped, I hope. Who have kindly agreed to serve on our panel this evening. I'd also like to thank international expert and visiting British academic Sir Albert Ainslie Green for joining us this evening. Sir Al, welcome, and thank you for taking part in our event. Now I'd like to say a few words to anyone here this evening or joining via the webcast whose life may be touched by mental health challenges. Whether you're living with the mental health concern of your own or working to support a family member, it's essential to understand one very important thing. You are not alone. You are not alone. I know from my own experiences with PTSD, it can be an isolating experience, but I know that but knowing that you're not alone is a valuable gift. So don't be afraid to ask questions. Reach out for support, and please know there are people here this evening and around the province who care, who understand, and who can help make the road a little easier. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you someone who has enjoyed a very long and distinguished career of making life better for young Canadians and their families. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Jean Clinton. Dr. Clinton is visiting us from McMaster University, where she serves as a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience. She's a respected authority in a number of areas, including children's mental health and the fine art of fostering resilience and healthy brain development in children and youth. Dr. Clinton has shared her expertise with people across Canada and around the world, and now we have the pleasure of learning from her this evening. Again, thank you all for coming this evening, and I'll ask you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Jean Clinton to the podium. Dr. Clinton. Oh, is that yours? I dropped it on the floor.
Thank you very much, Your Honours. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to be here in Alberta. I have to say that, one, I was terrified to hear that Your Excellencies were both going to be here. And then I get this email to say that Professor Sir Ainslie Green, the Commissioner for Children of the UK, was also present. But I don't feel so badly because he didn't bring his corgis. So I don't have to worry about cleanup. I am really very, very honored to come here to your province from Ontario as a province that really is leading the field in so many ways. And how do we come together as communities to make sure we have the best outcomes for all of our children? There are wonderful, wonderful things happening in Alberta, and I'm very thrilled to be here. I am going to speak to you about the brain. I love the brain, I have to say. I started medical school thinking I was going to be some big neurosurgeon, and then I met some people like this guy behind me, Dr. Dan Offord, and I was sunk. I had to be a child psychiatrist. And I always start off my presentations. I'm trying to tape this presentation, but it's not working very well, so I'm going to hand it over to one of my friends. And she's going to gracefully trip over and come. Thank you, Dr. Bellis. So Dr. Dan Offord, who you see here, was a wonderful giant in the field. He's the one, actually, who put children's mental health on the map. In 1984, when he did the Ontario Child Health Survey, we didn't really know how big an issue is children's mental health. I actually remember having book club or journal club, and we talked about, is there a difference between children and adolescent mental health and adult mental health? Because at that time, thank you, Joyce, at that time we were using adult criteria. And we really had no idea how big an issue it was. So the very famous 1 in every 5 children having a serious mental health problem or even disorder was the work of Dr. Dan Offord. And he believed that if we have no data, then there's no problem, so we don't need any action. Well, Dan got the numbers. I would love to be able to say that since 1984 and the Ontario Child Health Survey, we have had so much action on children's mental health that the numbers are lower. I don't think so. One of the things that Dan used to talk about is, in order for change to happen, what we need to see is structural advance. We need to see at a societal level, a legislative level, movement forward for children, that it doesn't matter what government comes in, that we don't get Cameronized, as is happening in Britain, that we don't get Harperized or whatever, that when a government comes in, that we have enough in place that the pages will not be turned back for children. So structural advance. If we can think about how we might accomplish that, then I think we'll take a much, much stronger step forward for all of our children. Now, Dan was famous for saying that growing up in Canada is like running a race. So it depends on where you live in Canada, whether you live in a well-to-do suburb or whether you live in a poor neighborhood. You've got access to public education. You have access in Canada to a public health system. But that's not enough, because the barriers and the issues that children face have a huge impact on how they do. That very often your postal code can determine where you end up. Well, our job, all of our job, is to see what can we do to make a difference. I think that what you're doing, Your Honour, is just such an important piece of the work. And that is bringing people together to increase awareness, to develop action plans, and make sure that all of our children are at promise, Now, the other big thing about Dan that I like to say is when you were with him, you had a sense of felt connection. You really felt by Dan. And so everywhere I go, and I talk to quite a few people across the country, I ask, can we, as mums and dads, can we, as teachers, as grandparents, as aunties, can we make sure that the children in our lives feel felt? And I have this delusion, my friend Nancy says, or is a goal, that every child will have at least one adult whose eyes light up when they enter the room. Can you imagine what that would be like? Ideally, it would be 5 adults whose eyes light up. Well, I'm going to show you that that's not just a good idea, but in fact, there's a lot of neurobiology behind eyes lighting up. I want to, if you will allow me, I'd like to dedicate this talk tonight to our very dear friend Clyde Hertzman, who passed away just in March, much too young. He was a brilliant man who coined the term biological embedding. And I'm going to be talking a lot about that this evening, because I'm going to be talking about the early years, about what happens, how the brain develops very early in life. And the way that Clyde Hertzman from UBC, though he was a McMaster graduate, The way that Clyde described the biological embedding is that the things that happen, the experiences that we have as babies and as children, leave a biological signature that affects our DNA. It doesn't change the code of the DNA, but it turns on or silences the DNA. So why are we so interested in what happens to our kids, and why are we focusing so much on what happens early? Well, because of some of the work that Clyde did in England, where he looked at a group of people born in 1958. And he has followed them, he and his group followed them every number of years and did studies with them. And so Clyde could look at someone's math score and how tall they were at age 7, and then have a pretty good guess at what their heart status was at 45. Holy cow. What does that mean? It means that there is a very, very long reach for childhood. That what happens in the early years particularly, but also again in the teen years, marks our biology in very long-lasting ways. So I'm going to be telling you about how love builds brains. And by love, I mean what we usually mean by love. But I'm going to try and convince you all, except you're all here, so you're already convinced. But it's not just the love of parents, but it's the love of community. And that it really does take a village to raise a child. But the village needs to be functional. Right? We don't want the fun and dysfunction to be the village. We want all of us really battling for children. Now, this picture here, which you can see, is from a family that I have the honor of knowing in Kenya. And these two little ones, Eric and Phyllis, have been adopted by this family. Love builds brains. Love fights HIV. Love fights heart disease. Pippa here, or Pipa, was born and acquired AIDS in hospital. She was a biological child. And she almost died. And her parents, once she came through very difficult times, as they were driving and saw all the orphanages, they said, God gave us our little Pipa for a reason. And the reason was we now know how to look after medically fragile babies. So we are going to adopt babies who nobody else wants. So love builds brains. As I saw these little ones last February, I saw their pictures as floppy babies, and I see them now as active, verbal, really, really interesting little characters. But I have to tell you about my own little characters, because I'm a medical doctor. I always have to give a medical disclaimer. You need to know that I'm not being sponsored by some big drug company. I'm not. These are my sponsors. I say they're my 5 great kids. And anybody with a warped sense of humor, I don't have a couple of other ones that aren't so great. These are all. And you know, I bring my children with me because I want you to know that I am speaking from the heart, that I am very grounded. My children, being a mom is my #1 job. Unfortunately, at times, I'd like the job to be over. But when you have an 18 and a 21-year-old, there are issues that come up. But and the other thing is, it means you can ask me any question whatsoever. You know, how do you handle the police arriving at your door, X, Y, and Z? So ask any questions. So, I want to propose that there is wisdom and knowledge in many of our communities. As I learn more about our First Nations people and the wisdom of the elders, I am amazed that what we are finding out in neuroscience is one of the elders' teachings. So, in our First Nations and many of our newcomer families, children are the sacred ones. They are the heart of the nation. When you're making a decision, think about the children and this next 7 generations, because what we are doing now is going to have a very, very, very long reach. Do we as non-First Nations people have this kind of driving belief? Well, we do. We signed on to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which would be a values-driven decision-making process, but we're not necessarily keeping up to our obligations there. So the long reach of early childhood, the long reach of thinking over the next 7 generations. If we ask ourselves as Canadians, what are the questions that we ask when we meet each other? The Maasai, this is little Phyllis, the Maasai ask, how are the children? That's their first question. It's not, how's the economy? How are the roads? It's, how are the children? I worry that we are not thinking enough as a community, as a country, about how are the children. Now, why do we need to think about the children? Well, we have a reality that is true in many countries. And the reality is that I'm a doctor, but I don't have very much to do with how healthy people are. The things that make the biggest impact on health are the social determinants of health. It's not so much the drug treatment that I may have, thank you, yes. It's not so much the drug treatments, but what are the conditions in which children and families are living, growing, working, aging, and dying? Sir Michael Marmot is a well-known scientist who did a report for the World Health Organization in 2008, Closing the Gap in a Generation. He believes that we can close the gap between the rich and the poor in a generation. Now, why would we want to close the gap between the rich and the poor? Well, because in just about any domain you look at, health, education, employment, we see a very big gradient, a big slope between how do the poor do and how do the rich do. And what we see in country after country after country, that the poor die more quickly, that they don't have the same education, that they're more likely the young people not to be employed or in education or in training. And the steeper that gradient, that slope, the worse off we all are. So Sir Michael Marmot in this 2008 report said this is a social justice issue. Why is it that a woman in Botswana her average age, life expectancy is by around 48, 50. Yet in Japan, it's 82. What's that, genes? It's the social determinants. How she lives, where she lives, access to clean water, support in her mothering. Now, we can think, oh, well, yeah, Botswana, Africa, that's far away. But what about, he reports also, on the center of the universe, Glasgow. And in Glasgow, 2 miles apart, the life expectancy, the difference is 21 years today. So then we got interested in this kind of stuff in Hamilton, Ontario. And we did a series, Code Red. I used the royal we. I shouldn't use the royal we with a sir and a your honor. But so anyway, some people did it, and I'm telling you about it. So Code Red, we found that the difference between where I live in a nice area of Hamilton and where my brother teaches in inner city Hamilton, today, life expectancy of a baby born with all that excitement, 21-year difference. Today in Hamilton. I know that if you were to do the same studies, you'd find that we have a very big social justice issue because we don't need to have it. We can close the gap in a generation. So I'm going to start off just by asking us to think about how are our children doing? How are the kids? So in 2008, the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, asked Dr. Kelly Leitch, who is a physician in Ontario, asked her to be the national advisor on health. And she went all around the country. She did all kinds of research, and she identified in her report called Reaching for the Top that Canada, she looked at the 29 richest countries. Canada was 21 out of 29 in child well-being, including mental health. 22nd in preventable childhood injury and death, and 27th in childhood obesity. 2008. We all heard about that, right? Not. It hardly made the news. This was the Prime Minister's national advisor. What happened with that report? Shelved. So we never give up. Last week or the week before, UNICEF released its next report on the well-being of children. There was one in 2007 where Canada was 12 out of the 21 richest countries overall. Now, I would just want you to imagine if there was a study or surveys done to see if you were a 50-year-old man and you went into the emergency room with chest pain, and we want to see how is your survival compared to all of the other rich countries, and we were 12 out of 21 in survival from a heart attack, do you think we would still be there? Do you think that that would just be ignored and have a fleeting thing on the news? Absolutely. We'd know about it. Well, it didn't cause any ripple. It did in the UK. The UK in 2007, that you had a big fight with the US. Who's going to be the lowest, right? Who's going to be lower, because the UK and the US battled for it. From that, I understand there was a white paper, Every Child Matters, and the development of a position of a commissioner for children. What did we do? Not much. The report came out last week. We are now 17th out of 29. We have dropped. What was in the news? That we are the country with the highest percentage of kids smoking dope. Now, my guys say they don't inhale, but you know. That's what made the news. That's what made the news. We have children, 11, 13, and 15, reporting that their life isn't great, that their life is not great, that their friends aren't that friendly, that they don't really have many people to talk to, that bullying is on the rise. Overall, we were 17 out of 29. That really got us all going, didn't it? No. And then we look at, let's do something about mental health for kids. Well, there's no way that child psychiatrists or a mental health system is going to address the needs when they're this big. We have an epidemic. We all need to be thinking about this. 23% of Canadian youth aged 12 to 19 and 34% of our Aboriginal youth, they say that their perceived mental health is something less than very good. Are we going to tolerate that? Now, the other thing that we know is that close to 70% of adult mental health begins in adolescence and childhood. So we really need to think about how our children are doing. And then we look at Edmonton and say, okay, well, wow, our teenagers, they're not doing so great. But how are our 5-year-olds doing? Clyde was one of the big supporters of the EDI, the Early Development Instrument. And in the EDI, kindergarten teachers fill out 103 questions about children's physical development, their social development, their emotional, their language, communication. And in Edmonton, 30% of your children are arriving at school without the skills they need to do well. 30%. You've heard all about this, right? It's just been blaring out there. The range is from maybe 10% to 60%. So some kindergarten teachers have 60% of their children who don't have the skills to learn well in school. Now, if we had a super education system, and we could say, it doesn't matter how they come, we're going to fix them, that might be less worrisome. But in fact, what we know from the studies and others that Clyde did is the vulnerabilities that kids have when they come in, they tend to keep and stay there. So school doesn't have that much of an impact overall. So what's that telling us? It's telling us that what happens before children arrive at school has a great, great influence. Now, we might say to ourselves, okay, well, you know, those kids, the mums had those children. It's up to them to look after it. And I'm frequently on the radio in Hamilton. This is a bit of a redneck town. And so somebody always calls and says that kind of thing. Oh, well, you know, they had them. They should look after them. But, you know, here's this. I have this from Dr. Nora Lou-Roos in Manitoba. Whose responsibility is it? You're here tonight, so we know that we all think the same way. But when you look at this, here's a mother duck doing what a mother duck's supposed to do. She's looking after her kids, and she comes across a social condition over which she has no control. What happens? Bye-bye ducklings. Now, whose responsibility is it to look after that situation? Now, those of you who are big sucks in the room like me, look at it's a sewer, and they're duckies so they can swim and they paddle to the sea or something, okay? So, no PTSD for the ducklings, all right? Whew. But you get the point. We now know convincingly that it takes the community. Now, I should also tell you that I make the joke about PTSD with Your Honour because he was joking in the back room. So I do not take PTSD lightly at all. But, you know, we really need to be thinking in our day-to-day life and world, what is our values-driven question and conversation? On the radio with CBC yesterday, a man called in and he said, you know, this is very timely. I was just talking to my neighbor about this. And I was close to ecstasy because I know that we have made it when across the neighborhood backyards, people are talking about the importance of the early years. Then we have made it. If they're talking about children's mental health, hallelujah. So I was close to ecstasy. My biggest exercise is jumping to conclusions. You need to know that. You can tell. But so he said, we were just talking about this, and then he asked me about private versus public school. Really good question, because what he was focusing on was social and emotional development or academic development. But really, what is our question? Are we asking ourselves, what is a child? How do we view the child? Do we see the child as an empty vessel that we have to stuff with all of our wonderful curriculum, that we have to do all of this, make them behave? Is that our view of the child? And, you know, we can think about curriculum, we can think about all kinds of different things. Some of my patients describe this as stuffing the duck. You know, you stuff all that great information in. Or is our view of the child that children are capable, that they're competent, that our job, as Sir Alfred North Whitehead said, is to create we are gardeners, creating the space for children to thrive. I have a very big worry that across the country, people are focusing on numeracy and literacy as the school readiness skills. Hugely important. But what are they tossing out? They're tossing out social and emotional development. And so I coined the term, the tyranny of cognitive seduction. Isn't that great? The tyranny of cognitive seduction. That we have been fooled into thinking that numeracy and literacy is what's going to help our kids get ahead. The science is telling us that how you get along, your social and emotional readiness for school, is a better predictor of outcome than IQ. So, what is our view of the child? This is from the work of Loris Malaguzzi and Reggio. So when we say, what's our view of the child? We might say that we want them to be happy, to be smart. We want them not to be sad. And so what have we done? Well, remember I said there about the long reach of past the 7 generations. Well, we have parented in a particular way, I'm going to propose, that has been driven by, oh my God, our kids can't get upset. We want them to be happy. We want them to have self-esteem, right? So my parents were war babies. And so a big belief in management and doing what you were told, following the rules. They had us, the baby boomers. And so the baby boomers were a whole exploration into freedom of speech, women's rights. You know, remember Woodstock? Who remembers Woodstock? If you did, you weren't there. Yes. So, but all of this fighting for freedom. So we raised our children to be independent, to think for yourself. Then our children, they grow up, more mums in the workforce, the first latchkey kids, right? Home, watch the Flintstones and drink your Freshie. Freshie? Are you kidding? Talk about toxic sludge. But our children it was all about being independent. Whatever you want to be, you can be. Then we've got the self-esteem movement comes in. I affirm you. I affirm you. You breathe in and out all frickin' day, here's a sticker. So, when I was a kid, when we played musical chairs, you took away a chair. I'm very sad to say. So, now, you don't take away a chair because that might hurt somebody's feelings. We don't have winners and losers anymore. We have winners and participants. Everybody gets a trophy, right? So here we have a culture that is not letting our kids experience risk, experience some disappointment. We think that that was what you do to build good mental health. But it's not. What is good mental health? What is? And it really is developing the capacity to experience, to regulate, and to express your emotions. It is to be able to form close interpersonal relationships and to be able to explore the environment and learn. Is this the drive that we have as parents? Because really, children's mental health is all about healthy social and emotional development. So we then have to ask ourselves, okay, so how do we go about focusing on and creating environments where children do have these healthy emotional relationships? And it's back to the work of Clyde. In that World Health Organization report, Chapter 5 is called Equity from the Start. Fraser Mustard, who's one of our other Canadian gurus, he wondered, why are some people healthy and others not? What are these social determinants of health? And he was a big scientist, and he was a brilliant thinker. And he decided and convinced all of us, and we could not falter from the vision, that what happens in the earliest years are so important. Because these earliest years are the years when the brain is the most malleable. It changes the most in the early years. The environment influences the brain in the early years more than at any other time during life. But when you look at where do we spend our money, we spend our money at the end of life when we can do the least change. And we spend the least money when the brain is the most changeable. So, I'm going to talk just a little bit now about what are the things that the village needs to think about to have healthy kids. And then I'll talk about some of the science of this. So, This again is from Dr. Hertzman and the team who wrote the Chapter 5 in the World Health Organization. So we have the individual child who comes with his and her characteristics. You know, you saw my 5 children. We thought we were perfect parents with my first. He was easy. He hardly ever cried. 18 months later, along came my Kathlina, mother killer. Honestly. We couldn't figure out what she wanted. You know, she only liked one side, not the other. I was a psychiatry resident. I had to read everything about it. Had she been our first, she might have been our last, right? But I'm a psychiatrist married to a doctor with a challenging temperament baby. How people looked at me, oh, that must be really hard. Have you read this book? What if I was a teen mum? What kind of support would I have had for that difficult child? She is now a wonderful, wonderful medical student, going to make a stunning pediatrician. But here we've got the individual child who interacts with the family, whoever the family is. You know, that family may be a nuclear family, becoming more and more rare. That family may be 21 other people in a 2-bedroom apartment in a high-rise in Toronto. That family influences the child. The residential area influences the family, influences the child, up and down. Are there safe places for children to play? Some of the kids arriving in Toronto, when the EDI is done by the teachers, they're very poor in their physical development. Why? Because they're not allowed out to run. They live in high-rise apartments that are and there's too many drugs. The mum isn't allowed out. So the first time one of the kids that I heard about, the first time they had run was in the day of registration for school. So the residential area makes a difference. How many green spaces? We have nature deprivation disorder now. We don't let our kids out to play. The region, how many childcare spots? What are the decisions made about who's looking after the children? We have 80% of mums of children under 6 in the workforce. In Ontario, we have spots for maybe 12, 15%. Who's asking the question? Who's looking after the kids? Who's looking after the kids? So as you can see, the region, the nation, all of these things, the social determinants of health, have a huge difference on how children grow. So why do we care about this? Well, I have to tell you that I'm a brain geek. I love the brain. I hear and see most things relative to what's going on in the brain. And so why does the environment make such a big difference? I'm going to propose to you that scientists, the neuroscientists, are now telling us that the environment makes such a big difference because we are not just our genes. We are our genes that are interacting with the environment, and the environment turns on, and the environment being experienced turns on or silences genes. Babies are born with billions and trillions of brain cells called neurons. So they're born with them, but they haven't all decided who they're going to talk to, which of the neurons are going to hook up with each other. You know, it's kind of like Facebook. Who are they going to friend on Facebook? What networks are they going to have? And it's the experiences that babies have that determines how those networks get wired up. Now, here's a very simple example. You hear my Scottish accent, right? Isn't it lovely? Oh, the best accent in the world. So I have a Scottish accent because I grew up in Scotland until I was 11. So my brain cells were bombarded with the sound way before I could speak of a Scottish accent. And I was surrounded, my language as it was developed, so all of my brain cells involved in language, which is a bunch of different areas, they got fired up. Over and over again, the neurons connected up with each other. And when neurons fire together, they wire up together. They like that when they're doing it over and over again. There's different guck. I can give you a little more technical term than guck, if you want, for some of the stuff that make the neurons talk to each other and wire up. So I have a Scottish accent, as does my older sister and older brothers, but my younger siblings don't have an accent. Why? Well, my ability to speak without it got snipped away. It got snipped away. The neurons that were used got wired up together. The ones that weren't got snipped away. Now, when you hear my Scottish accent, you've got your own neurons that are firing. And I'm going to get some more of them active now. So when you hear my Scottish accent, you might think of Robin Williams and Mrs. Doubtfire, right? And any Star Trek fans in the audience? Remember Scotty? "Ugh, Captain, she'll never hold." So, as you hear my accent and I remind you of these movies, your brain cells are remembering and firing and wiring up together. You think it's funny, so there's areas in your brain that are releasing pleasant neurotransmitters, serotonin or maybe dopamine. So your brain has been built to think that that's amusing. What if you had a mother-in-law who is a real, you know what I mean? If you had an unpleasant encounter with someone with a Scottish accent, your brain, when I said that, would be completely different response from your experience. So here, as an example, this was a story that I heard from the Chief Justice in Ontario. She was reading a book, and there was a young boy who was 10 years old who had been in Auschwitz. And when he came out, he was in Switzerland. And the teacher asked him to come up and say, "Tell me what you see in this picture." Well, this is a picture of William Tell. And as I understand it, William Tell was walking through the woods and he had his hat on. And just at that time, Switzerland was trying to separate, and the prince on his horse had a rule, when you see me, take your hat off. But he didn't want to. He stood for the neutrality and the independence. So he was going to go to jail unless he shot an arrow to knock an apple off of his son's head, right? So do that or go to jail. So this little boy looked at that and froze. He could not speak. He couldn't answer. His brain froze. His emotional brain went into freeze mode. The teacher said, "Well, just tell me, what do you see?" Finally, he was able to say, "It doesn't make any sense." Why doesn't it make sense? Well, because they never wasted ammunition on children. They only gassed them. His brain had been sculpted by his experience. He looked at that picture and his emotional brain went, threat, 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 alarm. The Swiss kids looked at it and their brain, the areas that are reward and pleasure would have been lighting up. They would have been filled with pride. Completely different neural brain networks. Now, I have a degree in music. So whenever I tell this story, I start hearing the William Tell overture, da-da-dum, 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 dum-dum, in my head. Our brains are built by our experience, not just our genes. And the good news is that it can happen throughout life. The biggest change period, no question, is in the last trimester of pregnancy and the first couple of years. But we have another massive opportunity in the teen years because there's a whole lot of under construction going on in the teen years. But what the science is showing us now is that the brain is capable of change throughout life. There's a wonderful book called The Brain That Changes Itself. In that book, a man in his 60s has a major stroke. He can't walk and talk, goes to rehab, and is discharged at the usual time. But his sons say, this isn't Papa. This isn't the end of him being like this. So they worked intensively with him. One of them happened to be a neuroscientist. And he said, the brain develops from primitive functions becoming more complicated all the way to the most complex functions. So in order to learn how to walk, you first of all have to learn how to crawl. So they worked with their dad until he got back to teaching. He was a professor. He died climbing a mountain 10 years later. Had you told me that in 1981 when I graduated from medical school, I would have said it was science fiction. Science fiction. They did an autopsy because they thought, well, you know what, maybe his brain it didn't have necrosis, maybe the cells didn't die. Maybe they were just stunned for a long time. They saw a hole. His brain had rewired around those deficits. What does that tell us? Well, for me as a child psychiatrist, it tells me that neuroscience is bringing hope. That we can, if we find the right relationship and the right connection, we can help make great change. Now, the thing is, if you're working with some grumpy old fart, and they say, I've done this always, I can't change, you tell them, I heard this shrink last night, and she said, yes, you can, but you have to want to. So, let me just talk a bit about how important these earliest times are. Now, there are scientists who say that our human pelvis is a bit small compared to the human head. And any of you who have delivered big babies know this to be true. But what the scientists are saying is that a baby's head weighs only about a third or a quarter of the adult weight. So no other animals have their babies born so helpless and with their brain not fully formed. So there are those who say that babies are actually born, in terms of their brain, 9 months prematurely. That means we need to be thinking about the first year of life, at least, as creating an external womb. Do we do that? I can tell you in the US, with their 6 weeks of maternity leave, they do not. With infant care, 8-1. We need to be thinking as community about how are our babies growing. How babies grow their brains. It starts before you've missed your first period. The baby continues to have brain growth for many, many years. Massive in the first couple of years, then again, and it goes on for 24 or 25 years. Later in males. Sometimes a whole lot later in males. So I'm told. But as you see this, you can think about nature and nurture. But you can also think about the impact of alcohol. Alcohol causes brain damage. And so the brain is developing throughout pregnancy. If you've got lots of alcohol, when that little face is forming, then you might get the facial features of FAS. Most of the children with FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, do not have the facial features. But the brain is affected throughout. So no alcohol at any time in pregnancy is safe. Why? Because this is a neuron here. The brain neurons, they receive information in from finger-like branches called dendrites. So you're sitting here and you're hearing all kinds of things and your brain is getting all kinds of stimulus coming in and you're hearing my Scottish accent and you're noticing the lights and some of you are bothered by the lights and some of you are bothered by the sounds, but nobody's thinking about their buttocks. Well, now you are. Yes. And why? Because you have become adults, and as adults, you are able to have had all of that brain stuff coming in. Your brain knows about your buttocks, but your brain decides, I'm going to silence that message coming in. While babies haven't done the silencing yet. They're having all of the stimulus coming in. It turns on the DNA in the nucleus there, and the nucleus, the message will come in, it'll say, make more of this stuff, or no, we don't want this. So the signal comes in and either activates or silences the signal. And then as the signal comes in, and it's repeated over and over again, you see these little spines. And as the signal comes in, we get more and more and more and more and more of these spines. So as a baby is picked up when they're upset, and rocked and soothed, and read to, and spoken to and listened to, their little brain cells, all of these dendrites and axons are going to be talking to each other. The ones that get used over and over again get wired up. So a baby at 6 or 7 months, so you can picture here, you can picture all of these neurons all over the place listening. Baby of 6 or 7 months can hear every sound of every language. The scientists do these experiments where the baby's attention changes depending on whether it's known or not known. So they can hear the sound of every single language. So a little Japanese baby can tell the difference between R and L at 6, 7 months, because their neurons are firing, and where they talk to each other, neurons called synapses, they'll have a synapse jumping here and here when they hear the different sounds. But by the time they are 1 year of age, they can't hear the difference anymore. The little Japanese babies have not heard that R and L sound over and over and over again. So those neurons that at 6 months were firing, they have been snipped away. We have a process in our brain called apoptosis, and that is when a neuron, when the cells are not fired over and over again, then they die. So use it or lose it. So we now know that it's not about just your genes. We now know that it is all about how the environment turns on the DNA. And that science is called epigenetics. So that's on top of the genes. On top of the genes tells the DNA whether to be active or whether to be silent. Whether to make lots and lots of connections in those word areas because you're hearing tons, or whether to have lots of connections in that be on guard, watch out, this is a scary place, nobody picks me up when I cry. The brain forms no matter what the environment is. So we have a responsibility, and we've got some great judges in the audience who are paying attention to this and making sure that babies are not left in limbo, because babies' brains are not on hold while decisions are being made. Their brains are being built. So we have true, absolute knowledge now that the experiences that children have shape their brain architecture. And how does it happen? Well, look here. This is a baby, a tiny baby, back and forth, serve and return, serve and return. Why is that baby doing this imitating? Why? Because that dad is going to fall head over heels in love. The baby is very, very vulnerable. Babies start imitating very, very soon. Actually, babies are little scientists. Great book called Scientists in the Crib. Babies are watching and learning. They're finding out what are the social rules here. In one culture, it may be when you're excited, you raise your eyebrows. Babies are little scientists observing this. And it's not about flashcards. It's not about TVs. It's about serve and return. It's about love building brains. As that baby there, the back and forth, the picking up, the sensing, the smelling, the touching, the moving in space, the soothing of all the sensations, that is what is building the brain. It's not flashcards. It's not baby Einstein or baby Mozart or baby Britney or baby Bieber, I'm sure is coming out. What is happening here? What is happening here is as that mom's right brain is signaling to that baby's right brain, the right brain, we've got two hemispheres, two halves. The right brain is our emotional brain. The right brain, the left brain is language and logic and other, not exactly, but just go with me here. But so the right brain is your emotional brain. And we know from many scientists that as that mum or that caregiver and that baby are meeting right brain to right brain. That mom, that caregiver is helping soothe that baby. As that baby is soothed by being picked up and rocked and nurtured, the baby is learning, oh, I can soothe myself. We learn to regulate through relationship by being co-regulated. I want to show you one little video clip here that shows you, just back to the beginning, about how competent and capable babies really are.
Newborns are capable of remarkable emotional engagement with those who can attune themselves to the baby's signals.
So many of the infant's responses are motivated by emotions, and parents sensitive to these signals can help a baby learn a little bit more about himself or herself in the process of learning how to communicate.
This series of photographs captures a wealth of interaction which transpires between 7-day-old Jordan and his grandfather during one 30-second period. Jordan and his grandfather have discovered each other. They begin a playful interaction while they look eye to eye. Jordan looks at grandfather's mouth and sees it open. He imitates this action and again looks eye to eye. As grandfather opens his mouth wide in laughter, Jordan follows, opening his mouth even wider. Jordan throws his arms in excitement and watches his grandfather's eyes, lifting his head like grandfather does. Now it's a game between them. Notice how Jordan lifts his left arm and actually reaches out and touches grandfather's mouth, where the game is being played. Grandfather now opens his mouth wider. And with great energy, Jordan follows suit. They take much delight in this joyful engagement. Jordan throws his head back and opens his mouth even a bit wider. A moment of pause, but they're still engaged. Now grandfather switches to puckering his lips. The baby looks at grandfather's face. Jordan focuses on the mouth and imitates the puckering. After Jordan turns away to rest, grandfather paces himself to the baby, which is so important. All infants need frequent rest periods during or after intense interactions. By moving at the infant's pace, parents can protect the baby from being overwhelmed.
This baby, at 1 week old, his brain is being formed in this relationship, is being connected. Now, what scares me is my youngest is 18. And honest to God, we would have said this was gas. You know, like just have a big burp and we're good to go. So, here we know then that the brain is built by experience. And what is the most important experience that there is for kids? It's us. It's our loving, engaging relationship connecting. The brain doesn't just suddenly become full grown. There are different periods of time when the brain is really sensitive to certain aspects of development. So babies who are read to in utero, the big study looking at reading Dr. Seuss when you're pregnant, those babies recognized Dr. Seuss. So we've got different periods of time when the brain is learning, when the brain is just ready to have certain experiences over others. But the last concept I wanted to leave you with, so use it or lose it. And then the last is the impact of stress then. So just in these last couple of minutes, I'm hoping that I've invited you to think about what's our values-driven statement. Where are we putting our kids in terms of the importance of our society? Also then, why is it so important? Because we know that how the brain, what experiences are like for children, are building the architecture of their brain. How well they're going to be happy, competent, capable in school. But we also know that toxic stress has a profound, profound impact on the brain. Now, what do I mean by toxic stress? Stress is good. You know, as I'm trying to make my slides move here, like I'm stressed. If you were to hook me up, you would see that my heart rate's a little bit faster than it was. But you've been a great audience so far, so you're just going to go along with me, even though Sir, Professor, and Your Honor are here. You're just going to be nice. So this is a stress that's okay. Tolerable stress, my stress system has been turned on. But it's okay, it's positive stress. Tolerable stress, your stress system gets turned on, but it's turned on a bit longer. But if you've got nice people around you, if you've got good relationships, then that stress is neutralized a bit. The stress we worry about in our kids is toxic stress. And toxic stress is when our stress system is turned on, but there is no buffering. So when we think about children who live in poverty, when we think about children who are living in high marital conflict situations, which is not determined by how much money you have, we worry a lot about toxic stress. When we think about children who are living in maltreatment, we worry about toxic stress. So what actually happens in the brain with toxic stress is we've got this little organ in our brain called the amygdala, the fight or flight area. Remember I told you about the young boy in Switzerland? So he was frozen because his threat brain was turned on. Watch out! This is so dangerous. And what happens when we perceive threat is we freeze or we flee. Now the brain, when it senses this danger, the amygdala, we've got one on each side, sends signals down to release adrenaline so you can run. It also releases cortisol, which is our stress hormone. It goes up in the morning and then down. So it releases the cortisol so that you can keep on running. It changes stuff into energy. It helps with healing. It does all kinds of things. So when we experience threat, inside or outside, we're the only species that can think about something and turn on our stress response. Zebras don't get ulcers because they're not worried, they're not thinking about the lion, but we do. We do. So we've got the adrenaline going, we've got the cortisol going so we can keep on going. And we also have this area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is new learning and memory, that's going to help us remember, oh, watch out. When this guy walks in, you're in danger. He's going to bully you. Or when a door slams, we go, oh, it's okay. Oh, it's okay. That was the wind. So this new learning and memory is really important, the hippocampus. It also has little receptors on it that measure, see how much glucose there is, how much cortisol is coming out, and says, shut down. Whoa, we've had enough. Shut down. Well, what we're finding out from the science is that when you live in environments very early in your life and you've got this stress bombarding, those little cells in your new memory and learning area, you don't have quite as many of them, of the ones that tell your stress system to turn off. What does that mean? If you have negative early experiences, then when you get a stressor, the stress doesn't get as many signals to stop. What happens? Well, if your stress system is going, your immune system is going to get wiped out, worn out. You set the pathways for later disease. The science is showing that what this biological embedding is a lot to do with how your brain gets built and the stress. So very quickly, the way I think about this, and apologies to science and others, but that amygdala is like my little porcupine here. So, right, you've got the prickles going up. That's the amygdala saying, watch out. It sends down signals. Release adrenaline so you can run. Release cortisol. Oh, man, get the cortisol going so we can keep running. Got a good buddy, remember, called the hippocampus. Yeah, you guessed it. The hippocampus. The hippo. Now, these guys work really well together. They work really well together. This is novelty, helps with your attention. This is new learning and memory. Oh yeah, I've heard about synapses before. Oh yeah, I've heard about cortisol before. Oh yeah, and I can picture somebody whose cortisol goes up and stays up and up and up and up and up. The problem is not these two as buddies. The problem is when this, the amygdala, is firing, the hippo goes to sleep. When we have excessive toxic stress, the cortisol affects new learning and memory. This is the non-teachable moment. How much of our time working with kids, how much of our time trying to create change are we spending in the non-teachable moment? So one of the things, the eyes lighting up when a child enters the room, is about creating emotional safety. And you can't be emotionally safe if your prickles are up. So as a community, how can we go about ensuring that more of our adults are wondering, what's the hippo up to? What new learning can happen? In education, you know this inside out. A kid cannot learn if they're porcupine, if they're amygdala, if they are afraid of what's going to happen. We all look like we have ADHD when we are under this kind of stress. So, eyes lighting up, diminishing stress and feeling felt. So let me finish with a story about a great program called Roots of Empathy. And in Roots of Empathy, a baby and parents come into a classroom and the kids learn tons of the stuff that we've just talked about. And in that program, Mary Gordon, the founder, was talking to the Dalai Lama. And she said, you know, in one of the classes, we had a young boy who was 14. The other kids were 10. He had seen his mum murdered when he was 4. He had all kinds of diagnoses, and he had been in multiple foster homes. So the way his brain was built was very different. Now, in the class, they were talking about temperament. And the mum said, you know, we wanted a baby who was really snuggly, but you get the baby the Creator sends down. And so he loves to look out on the world and kick his feet. So we have him in this snuggly. Who would like to try the snuggly? The mum asked. And didn't this boy Daryl say, me? So up he comes, and the mum handed him the baby, and that baby snuggled right in. And then he went to the chair, and he just rocked back and forth and back and forth. And at the end of the class, Daryl came up. He gave the baby back to Mum, and he turned to the Roots of Empathy facilitator, and he said, do you think someone who's never been loved can learn to be a dad? That baby, that program, changed his brain. The power of one, the power of relationship, the power of connection is massive. We must not forget that. We mustn't let the neuroscience blind us to think that it's over, because it's not. We, each of us, have the power to reach out and make a difference in the lives of so many children. So I so thank you for inviting me here and making me feel that you're listening so well, and I really hope that we will be able to go forward and make a big difference for the lives of all of our kids. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Oh, thank you.